A Karen, convinced the royal guard was just for show, snatched his sword with smug confidence. But one swift move from the guard turned her arrogance into a moment she would never forget. Here's what happened. Before we continue, let us know in the comments below where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another incredible story showcasing the bravery and discipline of the Royal Guard. You won't want to miss it. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as Sarah Matthews adjusted her designer handbag, her manicured nails drumming impatiently against the leather. At 42, she carried herself with the artificial authority of someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions. Her blonde highlights caught the light as she surveyed the palace grounds like a queen assessing her domain. "Excuse me," she called out sharply to a young family trying to take photos. "You're in my way." Her voice carried that particular tone of entitlement that suggested the world existed solely for her convenience. The family hurriedly stepped aside, the mother pulling her children closer as Sarah strode past, her expensive shoes clicking against the pavement with military precision, though she would have bristled at the comparison. "Another tourist trap," she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying that distinctive accent of privileged London suburbs. "All these guards standing around like statues, and for what? We pay their salaries with our taxes, and they can't even be bothered to acknowledge us." A palace tour guide nearby visibly winced at her volume, but Sarah was just warming up. She'd spent the morning making similar scenes at the Tower of London and Westminster Abbey, leaving a trail of uncomfortable tourists and exasperated staff in her wake. Self-proclaimed advocate for tourist rights, she viewed every historic site as a personal stage for her crusade against what she called outdated pomposity. "Did you know," she said loudly to a group of American tourists who hadn't asked, "that these guards are technically public servants? They work for us." She gestured expansively at the palace. "All of this belongs to the people, but try telling them that." Her laugh was sharp and brittle, like breaking glass. The Americans exchanged uncomfortable glances before moving away, but Sarah hardly noticed. Her attention had fixed on something else, a Queen's Guard standing at his post, his scarlet uniform pristine in the morning light. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him, the way a predator might size up its prey. "Now there's someone who needs a lesson in public service," she muttered, adjusting her blouse with practiced precision. Her heels pivoted on the spot as she changed direction, heading straight for the guard's position. The crowd of tourists between her and her target parted instinctively, something in her bearing warning them to clear a path. A retired military officer, distinguished by his bearing even in civilian clothes, noticed her approach and frowned. He'd seen that look before, the expression of someone about to create a scene for their own entertainment. His hand moved unconsciously to touch the service pin on his lapel as he watched Sarah draw closer to the guard's position. "Watch this," Sarah announced to the nearest bystanders, her voice carrying the same tone she used when complaining to restaurant managers. "I'm going to show you all how to handle these overpaid mannequins." Her handbag swung from her arm like a weapon as she marched forward, each step carrying the weight of decades of unchecked privilege. The guard remained motionless, but there was something in his bearing, a subtle tension visible only to those who knew what to look for, that suggested he was acutely aware of the approaching storm. Sarah planted herself directly in front of the guard, her posture a poor imitation of his military bearing. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I'm a tax-paying citizen, and I have some questions about your role here." The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, looking past her with practiced discipline. "Hello? I'm speaking to you." She waved her hand in front of his face, close enough that he could probably smell her expensive perfume. "This selective muteness might work on the tourists, but I know my rights. You're a public servant, and I demand acknowledgement." The retired military officer had moved closer, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary. His weathered face showed the careful neutrality of someone who had seen similar situations escalate before. A palace tour guide paused her group nearby, her rehearsed speech about royal history dying on her lips as she watched the scene unfold. "Let me explain something to you," Sarah continued, her voice rising. "This whole silent routine, it's outdated, archaic. We're not living in the Victorian era anymore." She circled him like a shark, her designer heels clicking against the pavement. "These uniforms, these weapons, they're just props, and you're just an actor, aren't you? A performer paid by my tax money to stand here and ignore the people who pay your salary." A young couple with children began to edge away from the scene, the mother whispering something about finding a better spot for photos. But others in the crowd remained, drawn by the same morbid fascination that makes people slow down to observe traffic accidents. "Do you know how much money I pay in taxes each year?" Sarah demanded, moving deliberately into the guard's personal space. "More than you'll make in a decade of playing dress-up, I'd wager." Her voice carried the practiced sneer of someone who measured worth solely in pounds and pence. The guard remained motionless, but there was a subtle change in his bearing. A tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his grip on his ceremonial rifle. These minute changes went unnoticed by Sarah, but the retired officer saw them clearly. His own posture straightened instinctively, recognizing the signs of a soldier maintaining discipline under provocation. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Sarah announced to her unwilling audience. "They think they're above us, above the law, above common courtesy." She fumbled in her expensive handbag, producing a small notebook. "I'm recording all of this. Every instance of disrespect, every moment of ignored civilian oversight. By the time I'm done, there won't be a newspaper in London that hasn't heard about how these guards treat the public." The tour guide had fully stopped her group now, her face showing professional concern. She'd seen tourists try to provoke the guards before, but there was something different about this woman. A calculated malice that went beyond the usual thoughtless disrespect. "Tell me something." Sarah leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a stage whisper. "Does it make you feel powerful, standing here in your costume, pretending to be important?" She reached out as if to touch his uniform, but stopped just short, not out of respect, but rather like someone playing with fire, testing how close they could get before being burned. The morning had grown warmer, but several observers noticed a distinct chill in the air around the guard's position. His stillness was no longer ceremonial. It carried the weight of genuine military discipline, of someone who had faced worse threats than an entitled civilian with a grievance. "No response? Fine." Sarah's voice took on a harder edge. "Let's see how well you maintain this little act when I start asking the real questions. About the waste of public funds, about the outdated monarchy you're protecting, about the whole circus this place represents." She stepped even closer, her next words carrying the threat of someone used to getting their way through sheer force of will. "Trust me, soldier boy, by the time I'm done here, you'll wish you'd shown me the basic courtesy of acknowledgement." "You know what really gets me?" Sarah's voice rose another octave, bitter amusement colouring her tone. "It's not just the silence, it's the arrogance of it all." She gestured at the guard's ceremonial sword, her eyes fixing on its polished surface with unsettling intensity. The morning light caught the blade's edge, reflecting her own distorted image back at her. "Look at this. Carrying weapons in public, right in front of children. But because it's tradition, we're all supposed to just accept it. Accept that some man in a costume can stand here armed, like we're living in the Dark Ages." The retired military officer shifted his weight, years of service allowing him to recognize the dangerous gleam in Sarah's eyes. He'd seen that look before, in Baghdad, in Kandahar, in places where civility was about to give way to something darker. His hand instinctively moved toward the service medal in his pocket, a habit formed during moments of impending conflict. The tour guide had completely abandoned her script now, her hand hovering near the radio at her belt as she watched the situation deteriorate. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize the signs of a situation spiraling beyond the usual tourist misconduct. I've done my research, you know, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the smug tone of someone who'd spent an hour on Wikipedia and considered themselves an expert. These swords, they're public property, paid for by taxpayers, which means, technically, they belong to us. She emphasized the last word, leaning forward until her face was inches from the guard's immobile features. Her breath, tinged with expensive coffee and entitlement, fogged the polished brass buttons of his uniform. Did you hear me? They belong to us, to me, which means you have no right to deny me access to what is legally mine. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the palace grounds. Sarah's shadow fell across the guard's polished boots like an oil slick, her movements becoming more agitated with each passing moment of silence. The precision-cut hem of her designer dress swayed with each aggressive step, a pendulum counting down to confrontation. "Let me tell you about the complaint I filed last week," she announced, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. Her voice carried the practiced projection of someone who had spent years making scenes in upscale restaurants and boutiques. "About another one of you lot, standing there like you own the place. The ministry said they'd look into it." She made air quotes with her manicured fingers, the diamonds on her rings catching the light like tiny accusations. "But we all know how that works, don't we? Protecting your own, keeping up appearances. Just like the overpriced private school I pulled my daughter from last month, when they wouldn't accommodate her special diet. All these institutions thinking they're above accountability." A group of school children on a field trip had stopped nearby, their navy blue uniforms stark against the palace's pale stones. Their teacher, a woman with kind eyes and worry lines, tried to hurry them along as Sarah's voice grew more strident. But Sarah was like a performer now, playing to her captive audience with increasing intensity. The children's wide-eyed stares only seemed to fuel her performance, their innocent curiosity twisted into ammunition for her crusade. "You think that uniform makes you special?" She circled closer, her designer heels clicking against the pavement like a metronome counting down to disaster. Each step was deliberate, a predator's dance learned in corporate boardrooms and charity galas where she'd honed the art of intimidation. "I've seen security guards at Tesco with more authority than you. At least they have the decency to respond when spoken to. When I complained about the produce quality last week, at least they had the courage to face me directly." The guard's position remained perfect, but those who looked closely might have noticed a subtle change in his bearing. The retired officer certainly did. He recognized the coiled tension of a soldier preparing for action, even as discipline kept him motionless. It was the same tension he'd felt in combat, that microsecond between spotting a threat and responding to it. The guard's fingers, though perfectly still on his rifle, had whitened slightly at the knuckles beneath his immaculate white gloves. "Here's what's going to happen." Sarah's voice dropped to a threatening purr, the same tone she used when informing service staff they'd just lost their jobs. "Either you acknowledge me, a tax-paying citizen exercising her right to interface with public servants, or I'm going to make today very interesting for all of us." Her hand moved to her bag again, withdrawing her phone, the latest model, its case adorned with a designer logo that probably cost more than most people's weekly salary. "I've got journalists on speed dial who'd love to hear about how these elite guards treat the public. How they stand here with deadly weapons, ignoring valid civilian concerns. My friend at the Daily Mail would have a field day with this." She stepped even closer, her next words carrying the weight of someone unused to being denied. The jasmine notes of her expensive perfume mixed with the metallic scent of the guard's polished buttons and sword, creating an oddly discordant combination. "I've brought down better men than you know, business executives, local councillors. They all learn eventually that I'm not someone to be ignored." Her laugh was sharp and humorless, echoing off the palace walls like breaking glass. "But you're going to be different, aren't you? Going to stand there with your little sword and your fancy hat, pretending none of this matters? Let me tell you something about power, soldier boy. It belongs to those who know how to take it. The tension in the air had become almost tangible. Several tourists had stopped taking photos, sensing that they were witnessing something more dangerous than the usual attempts to make the guards react. The tour guide had quietly moved her group back, her experienced eyes recognizing the signs of imminent trouble. "Last chance," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the finality of an ultimatum. "Acknowledge me. Show some basic respect to the people who pay your wages, or—" Her eyes fixed again on the ceremonial sword, something dangerous flickering in their depths. "Or I'll show everyone here just how powerless you really are." The guard's eyes remained forward, his posture parade ground perfect. But there was something in his stillness now that spoke of contained power rather than ceremonial rigidity. Like a lightning rod before a storm, he stood ready. Not for the tourist antics he usually endured, but for something his training had prepared him to handle. Sarah's patience, already stretched tissue thin, finally snapped. "Right then!" she hissed, her refined accent cracking to reveal something uglier beneath. "Let's see how well you maintain this little act when I—" Her hand moved toward the ceremonial sword, her intentions becoming crystal clear as her fingers reached for the polished hilt, with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. The polished metal was cool beneath her grasp. Centuries of tradition about to be violated by one woman's entitled rage. Her manicured fingers curled around the ornate hilt, the ancient engravings pressing into her palm. Symbols of honor and duty she couldn't begin to comprehend. The leather of her designer bracelet scraped against the brass guard of the sword, a jarring collision of modern privilege and timeless authority. "Now, let's see how—" Her words cut off in a startled gasp as the guard's white-gloved hand locked around her wrist with mechanical precision. The pristine fabric of his glove contrasted sharply with her tanned skin and diamond tennis bracelet. His grip wasn't cruel, but it carried the unmistakable authority of someone trained in the controlled application of force. The kind of disciplined strength that came from years of military service rather than expensive personal training sessions. "Ma'am?" His voice cut through the morning air like the very blade she'd attempted to grasp, each word sharp and precise as a drill instructor's command. The sudden break in his silence seemed to make the very air vibrate with tension. "You are now attempting to disarm a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. Release the weapon immediately." His tone carried the weight of every parade ground order ever given, every battlefield command ever followed. Sarah's eyes widened, shock quickly morphing into indignation. The carefully maintained facade of her botoxed forehead crinkled in disbelief. How dare this mere soldier lay hands on someone of her status? She tried to jerk her hand away, but the guard's grip was immovable, like trying to break free from a steel vice wrapped in white cotton. "How dare you touch me? I'll have your job for this. I'll call my solicitor. I know people in Parliament. I'll—" "Final warning." The guard's voice remained measured, but carried an edge of steel that made several onlookers step back. His words cut through her threats like a hot knife through butter, each syllable precisely weighted with the authority of the crown. "Remove your hand from the weapon, or I will be forced to consider this an assault on a serving member of the military." The morning sun caught his brass buttons as he spoke, turning them into silent witnesses to her foolishness. Instead of complying, Sarah attempted to wrench the sword free with her other hand, her red-bottomed Louboutins scraping against the ancient stones as she struggled. The guard's response was immediate and precise. In one fluid motion, he shifted his stance, using her own momentum to spin her away from the weapon. The movement was beautiful in its efficiency, like a dance step choreographed by decades of military training. Her designer handbag went flying, scattering its expensive contents across the courtyard stones. Credit cards, luxury cosmetics, and a rose gold phone spinning across the pavement like fallen leaves. "Unhand me!" she shrieked, her carefully cultivated image of sophisticated outrage crumbling faster than her £1,000 makeup job. Her voice cracked, the refined accent she'd perfected at finishing school giving way to something rawer as she found herself secured in a textbook hold. "This is assault! I know my rights! Do you have any idea who my husband is?" "Your rights," the guard's voice remained professionally calm, carrying the same measured authority whether dealing with foreign dignitaries or entitled civilians, "do not extend to attempting to disarm military personnel." His grip hadn't tightened, but Sarah found herself completely unable to break free. Every twist and struggle she attempted was met with the immovable patience of someone who had trained for far worse scenarios. "Palace security has been notified. I suggest you remain still." The last words carried a hint of steel beneath their professional courtesy. The retired military officer had moved closer, his face showing grim approval of the guard's technique. Years of combat experience allowed him to appreciate the perfect balance of force and restraint on display. "Perfect regulation response," he commented, to no one in particular, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a veteran recognizing proper training in action. "Exactly how we trained for civilian interference. Textbook control and restraint, just like we practiced in Hereford." Sarah's face had flushed an ugly shade of red, her expensive makeup unable to conceal her mounting rage. The careful contouring and highlighting she'd had done at Harrods's beauty salon that morning now streaked with sweat and fury. "You're hurting me. Everyone here is witnessing this. I'll have you up on charges. I'll sue the palace. I'll go to the media. My husband's cousin works for the Times." "The only charges being filed today, ma'am," a new voice cut in as palace security arrived, their uniforms immaculate and bearing professional, "will be against you." The lead officer's tone suggested he'd dealt with similar situations before, though perhaps none quite so brazen. His eyes took in Sarah's dishevelled appearance and the scattered contents of her luxury handbag with the experienced assessment of someone who had seen entitlement meet reality many times before. The guard maintained his hold until security was in position, then released Sarah with the same precise control he'd shown in restraining her. She staggered slightly, her designer outfit now distinctly dishevelled, her carefully styled hair falling across her face in disarray. "This is outrageous," she spat, straightening her blouse with trembling hands. "I was simply exercising my rights as a citizen to inspect public property. He attacked me. Did everyone see that? He attacked me." What we saw, the retired officer stepped forward, his military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes, was an attempted assault on a serving member of the Queen's Guard, followed by a textbook defensive response. His voice carried the weight of experience. "I'd be happy to provide a statement to that effect." The tour guide nodded firmly. "As would I. And I believe my group's cameras caught the entire incident." Her professional smile had an edge to it now. Every moment of it. Security officers moved to escort Sarah away, but she wasn't finished. She tried to snatch her arm free from their grasp, her voice rising to a near scream. "You can't do this. Do you know who I am? I'll have all of your jobs. I'll make sure everyone knows how you treat tax-paying citizens." The guard had already resumed his post, his bearing returning to ceremonial perfection, as if nothing had happened. "I demand to speak to whoever's in charge." Sarah's voice echoed across the courtyard as security officers maintained their professional grip on her arms. "This is an outrage, a clear abuse of power." Her expensive heels scraped against the pavement as she tried to dig in her heels, refusing to be led away quietly. A senior palace security officer approached, his uniform immaculate and bearing unmistakably authoritative. "Ma'am, I'm Supervisor Richards. Let me be very clear about your situation." His tone was measured, but left no room for argument. "You have attempted to disarm a member of the Queen's Guard. This is a serious offence under multiple statutes, including the Military Protection Act." "Protection? He assaulted me." Sarah's voice cracked with indignation. "I was merely exercising my rights as a citizen to attempt to remove a weapon from a serving military officer?" The retired military man stepped forward, his intervention carrying the weight of experience. "I served 30 years in the forces, madam. What you attempted would be considered assault on any military base in the world." Sarah's face contorted with rage. "A military base? This is a tourist attraction. These are ceremonial guards with ceremonial weapons. You can't possibly—" "Actually, ma'am," Supervisor Richards cut in, "these are active duty soldiers carrying authorized military weapons. The ceremonial aspect of their duty doesn't diminish their authority or the seriousness of attempting to disarm them." The tour guide, who had been quietly providing a statement to another officer, spoke up. "I have over 40 witnesses in my group alone who saw you deliberately escalate the situation and attempt to grab the weapon." Her professional demeanor carried an edge of satisfaction. "Including several who captured it on video." "Video?" Sarah's composure cracked further. "You can't film me without consent. I'll sue. Public space, ma'am," Supervisor Richards replied calmly. "And in this case, the footage will be quite useful for the Crown Prosecution Service." Sarah's face paled slightly at the mention of prosecution, but her entitled rage quickly reasserted itself. "The Crown Prosecution Service. Don't be ridiculous. I was making a point about public accountability, about our right to oversight of these so-called guards." "Your point," the retired officer's voice was sharp with military precision, "nearly got you a much closer look at our military justice system than you intended. That guard showed remarkable restraint in my day." "Remarkable restraint indeed," Supervisor Richards agreed, nodding to his officers. "Ma'am, you'll be escorted to the security office where the Metropolitan Police will take your statement. I suggest you consider your words carefully. Attempting to justify an assault on military personnel rarely plays well in court." Sarah struggled against the officer's grip, her designer outfit now thoroughly dishevelled. "Court? This is absurd. I demand my lawyer. I demand to speak to your superiors. I'll have this whole charade exposed in every newspaper in Britain." "You'll have your chance to make all those demands at the station, ma'am," one of the officers said firmly, leading her away. Her protests echoed off the palace walls, growing fainter as she disappeared from view, still threatening lawsuits and media exposure. The morning sun had reached its zenith as normalcy returned to the palace grounds. The guard stood unwavering at his post, his ceremonial sword now carrying an added gleam of authority after the incident. Tourists gradually resumed their photos and tours, though many now maintained a more respectful distance, the lesson of Sarah's hubris still fresh in their minds. The retired military officer lingered a moment longer, exchanging a knowing look with the guard, the silent communication of those who understood the weight of service and sacrifice. "Well handled, son," he murmured, touching his service pin once more before departing. "Exactly by the book." The tour guide had resumed her duties, but her usual speech now carried an additional note of emphasis when discussing the guard's role. "These men," she explained to her group, "are not actors or ceremonial figures. They are active duty soldiers, tasked with protecting one of our nation's most important institutions. The ceremony you see is built upon very real authority and training." From the security office, Sarah's indignant voice could still be faintly heard, making demands and threats that would ultimately fall on deaf ears. Her expensive handbag and scattered belongings had been collected as evidence, her morning of entitlement ending in the decidedly unglamorous surroundings of a police interview room. But the guard's posture never wavered. His eyes remained fixed forward, his bearing perfect, his duty unchanged. What do you think about the guard's response to this situation? Was he justified in using controlled force to protect his position? Or should there be different protocols for handling civilian interference? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And here's something to consider. Why do some people feel entitled to challenge authority figures who are simply doing their duty? What does this say about our society's understanding of respect and tradition? If you enjoyed this video, Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the Royal Guards. Make sure to press the bell icon to never miss our daily uploads. Check out our previous videos about Royal Guard encounters appearing on your screen right now. And remember, true authority doesn't need to shout to be heard. It stands firm in silence until action becomes necessary. Until next time, stay respectful, stay curious, but most importantly, stay mindful of the boundaries that keep our traditions alive.